Thank you very much, and thank you so much for this invitation. It's a real honor to be able to speak alongside colleagues today. So I work for Airwars. Airwars is a UK-based non-profit organization. We act as a watchdog for civilian harm as it occurs in war zones around the world. We were founded about a decade ago, and in that time, we've documented civilian harm using a consistent methodology in many of the world's major aerial campaigns. This includes campaigns conducted by the United Kingdom and by the United States. Each of the thousands of incidents of harm we document is published on our website, clearly and transparently, both in the hope of pursuing accountability and as a lasting record of civilians killed. We share these records of civilian harm to help facilitate accountability processes, whether that's with media organizations, legal mechanisms, human rights investigators, the United Nations, or humanitarian groups. During the US-led coalition's bombing campaign against the so-called Islamic State, we referred all cases of civilian harm to the major militaries involved, and the United States has acknowledged hundreds of civilian deaths directly as a result of our work. In the days after October 7th, local human rights organizations in Gaza were forced to stop their field work as their staff fled their homes. Palestinian health ministry figures became subject to intense debate and critique, and international journalists, investigators have still not been allowed into Gaza. We decided we would try and address this gap with our own remote casualty recording methodology, which has proven reliable and trusted both in this context and around the world. In a letter to the MP Emily Thornberry on January 8 this year, Secretary of State David Lammy repeated this assertion also made by his predecessor, that the UK government was unable to carry out assessments of particular incidents affecting civilians in Gaza, and I quote, due to the opaque and contested information environment, as well as the challenges that the UK government had in, again I quote, accessing the specific and sensitive information necessary from Israel, their allies, about the intended targets and anticipated military advantage. Lammy is correct in acknowledging the complexity of the information environment. There is a vast and complex patchwork of information that surrounds each fatal incident for civilians in Gaza, as there is increasingly in war zones the world over. But this does not render this exercise impossible. This is the work our teams engage with. We work through this information environment, identifying sources from a Facebook page mourning the loss of a loved one, to images posted by journalists on Instagram, to pieces of paper held up to passing camera crews with lists of the dead after a single strike. Civilians are highly effective in documenting the world around them. In hundreds of incidents, there has actually been so much information that we have been able to deduce the exact coordinates of an airstrike purely based on open source imagery. To date, we've published detailed incident reports outlining where and how more than 10,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza. We have names, we have ages, we have professions. We know whether they were at home, sheltering in schools, whether they're in an ambulance with their families in hospitals, whether they were trying to find food at an aid distribution. We work chronologically, so we keep track of every single event every day, and we publish our findings on each strike as soon as we can. To date, we have identified more than 13,000 incidents of civilian harm, and we've published just over 1,200 on our website. These records tell us that by every metric, the level of civilian harm in Gaza is simply incomparable with any 21st century air campaign. It is the most fatal conflict for civilians that we have ever documented. And we aren't just coming to this conclusion now, we knew this weeks into the war. In October 2023 alone, we recorded at least 1,900 children killed. That is around 7 times more child fatalities than the deadliest month of any previous air campaign that we had documented. In 9 out of 10 incidents where women were killed, they were killed alongside a child. We found that on average, when civilians were killed alongside family members, they were killed alongside at least 15 of their relatives. This is not like anything we've documented before. These findings indicate a war on populated areas on a scale that would have been unimaginable in wars prior, especially in wars conducted by Israel's allies like the United Kingdom. We use this event-based methodology, and we work through open source investigative techniques. This allows us to orient civilian deaths in time and place. It also allows us to identify trends in real time, which were occurring very early on. In those opening weeks, we found that each strike was proving more deadly for civilians than in wars conducted by Israel's allies, to which Israel was comparing itself favorably. We found at least 65 incidents of civilian harm in the first 3 weeks where at least 20 civilians were killed. So that is 20 civilians killed in a single strike or kind of series of strikes in a single location. This is 3 times the number of high-fatality incidents we recorded during the Battle of Mosul, a battlefield so deadly that the UN deemed the whole city almost uninhabitable after the campaign was over, and bodies are still being recovered almost a decade later. These trends have remained consistent as the war has progressed. On March 18th this year, the day that Israel broke the ceasefire, we recorded what may turn out to be one of the bloodiest days of the war. Our teams identified almost 100 different incidents of civilian harm, that is the targeting of 100 locations across Gaza where civilians were killed or injured. To date, we've published a handful of these cases on our public archive, and the pattern has held. Patterns such as the destruction of whole families on family homes, high numbers of child fatalities in a single strike, all in that single day of bombardment. In recent months, our teams have documented attacks at aid distribution sites, publishing more than 25 separate incidents detailing civilians killed or injured while seeking aid. We've looked at attacks on civilians sheltering in schools, publishing more than 80 such incidents. And we spent this week looking at attacks in Gaza City as we have seen the campaign intensify. After the attack on Nasser Hospital, killing journalists and first responders last week, we shared our records with a number of media outlets detailing more than 20 other potential so-called double-tap attacks, where first responders have also been reportedly hit in rescue and recovery efforts. To Lami's point about challenges in understanding the intended targets from Israel. Last year, we released a film and an interactive map where we reviewed footage posted by the Israeli military themselves on their own social media accounts describing their targets, and we were able to link these statements to hundreds of civilian fatalities. Over the last year, we've documented 33 incidents involving attacks on civilians sheltering in schools, where we know exactly what the targets are because Israel has acknowledged it, in many cases declaring these strikes to be attacks on Hamas command and control centers. We have documented 467 civilians killed in these incidents alone. We've been able to review and analyze significant evidence of harm in Gaza, and we are a very small team. We are a dedicated and focused organization. We have expertise and experience on this single issue, so we know that others with maybe competing priorities and interests can't always take on this exercise, but that's why we've worked so hard to publish every case as soon as we complete our research with as much detail and transparency as possible. Every incident we publish includes all of our sources, which we also digitally archive in the event that sources get deleted or removed. Our assessments have been cited by the South African legal team at the International Court of Justice, by colleagues at GLAN in their case against the UK government. They've been cited in the US Congress by major international media outlets from the New York Times to The Guardian. In September 2024, we were named by the House of Commons Library as one of 4 fact-checkers on information in Gaza, and we have briefed officials in the UK FCDO on multiple occasions to explain our methodology and our findings and our approach in detail. This material is not confidential. It is being put online every day by Palestinians living under intense bombardment. Thank you.
Quickly, so first of all, even though you do note that the media has taken forward some of the data you provided, how, in a more general scale, would you assess the media's engagement with the data that you have provided? And also, have you noted a change in the weaponry that's being used in comparison to prior armed conflicts that you have documented in terms of the damage caused as well as the technology used?
Thank you. On the media engagement, I think one of the perhaps most disappointing and challenging things has been the sporadic media engagement. So we have been documenting every single day since October 7th, as have journalists inside Gaza. And what we've noticed is that the media engagement sort of comes at a flurry almost unpredictably. I mean, we saw a lot of engagement around the Nasser Hospital strike last week, as we should have. We saw a sort of flurry of engagement around the World Central Kitchen strike, again, as we should have. And in all of those circumstances, Airwars is often invited to speak and interview and say, okay, we'll put this in the wider context. And each time I have constantly been surprised that the journalists we're speaking to are also surprised that this attack has happened. You know, in the case of the Nasser Hospital strike, we had a lot of questions around, oh, what is a double tap strike? You know, we saw a double tap strike or a report of a double tap strike on the 8th of October, 2023. So I think, I mean, when it comes to media engagement, I think there's there are a number of really brilliant journalists out there who are doing a lot of reporting, both inside Gaza and outside. And the challenge is a sort of attention span. But a challenge is also normalization of very high fatality incidents. So I mentioned in this testimony, this number of 20 civilians killed per strike. I mean, this is something that in previous campaigns would have been extremely unusual. In May 2021, if you remember, there was a strike on Wahda Street with, it was a tunnel complex, and I think it was more than 40 civilians died, and it really captured the world's attention, and we had a lot of reporting on that. We've now seen so many of those, and each one of those has not had that level of attention. So I think it's a kind of, a flurry of information, attention, and then this kind of sporadic engagement. And then in terms of the weaponry, in terms of previous wars and campaigns, I mean, it's rather consistent, to be honest. I mean, we're seeing weapons that have been used, from old arsenals that the Israelis have had for a number of years. The thing that is distinct is not necessarily these weapons. I mean, we as an organization were founded particularly to look at Obama-era sort of so-called precision strikes in contexts like Yemen. I mean, that language, the narrative is all very consistent. The technology is moving forward in all sorts of frightening ways, as we heard from the doctors earlier today. The thing that is distinct is the consistent and intense and frequent use of those weapons, particularly those weapons on tents, on residential homes. So I think, I mean, I can submit information to you afterwards. We also do a lot of kind of identification of munitions, but that's the distinct thing is essentially their use.
One question from, sorry, Neve.
Just to follow up on that, wouldn't you say that Israel's use of AI and machine learning is a new way of warfare, creating target banks like the Lavender program, the Gospel program, and Where's Daddy program? And have you seen that in any other war zones?
I mean, the Israelis are not the only military that are using AI to assist targeting. We know that, I mean, the Americans did a wave of strikes in Iraq and Syria last year, and they acknowledged that they were using AI in the kind of assisting in the military campaign and target selection. I think the thing that's very difficult to understand is exactly how this new technology is being used, the automation of target selection, how that's being used and where the accountability is, where the oversight is. I think there are a lot of sort of misconceptions around how a particular strike is carried out. There are lots of people involved in making a decision around whether or not a strike is carried out. It's not a kind of entirely automated robotic system. So that means that there is still an unending room of accountability when it comes to this. I think the thing that we've seen, particularly from the reporting around the use of AI, like the Lavender Where's Daddy program, are the speed and scale of that warfare. And I think the important question for us is not to get distracted necessarily by the use of technology, but to say, how exactly are those strikes being decided upon and who is accountable at the end of the day? And I think that's consistent. I think we're going into a future of warfare where the use of AI to some extent is inevitable. And we just need to be able to, as a society and as a community, be able to hold those militaries to account and ask the right questions and understand those applications in quite some detail.
Thank you for what you've said. Just one quick question. When you've been briefing journalists or ensuring they've got access to stories, information, and so on, do you come across any examples of interference from the host broadcasting company, either back in London or New York or wherever they happen to be, to try to sanitize the news story that has been sent of the reality of what's happening in Gaza?
I mean, we're not sitting in the editorial rooms, so it's really difficult to say. I will say I've spoken to a number of particularly young journalists who are based outside of Gaza in the last couple of years, who have been trying to do story after story, and they haven't always been able to make it up into the front pages or kind of like into the publication pipeline. There are many reasons for that. I think from our perspective, it is this kind of steady chipping away of what is normal in warfare. And I think that's the kind of bigger danger in my sense of how editors are deciding this story versus this story, is this kind of sort of like normalized approach to understanding actually this event. Well, we saw 20 of these events. Why would we report on this one as if it's a news story? And that's the thing that I think has been more worrying from my perspective.